Welcome to Books and More Audio, the channel where ideas meet curiosity and every book becomes a journey of discovery. In today's video, we explore Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, a groundbreaking work that explains why human societies developed so differently across the world. This isn't just a history book, it's a scientific investigation into how geography, environment, and chance shaped the fate of civilizations. Join us as we uncover how nature, not race or intelligence, determined who conquered, who thrived, and who fell behind, and what that means for our world today. Jared Diamond and the Fate of Human Societies. I was born into a family that valued knowledge, language, and curiosity about the world. As a scientist and geographer, I've always been haunted by a simple yet profound question. Why has human history unfolded so differently across the continents? Why have some peoples developed technology, writing, and centralized states, while others remained hunter-gatherers or were conquered? After decades of research, I've realized that history is not a story of racial superiority or intelligence. The real roots of inequality lie in geography, biology, and the environment. While living among the people of New Guinea, sharing meals, listening to their stories, and watching their struggle to survive, I saw that they were as intelligent, capable, and insightful as any Westerner. Their environment, not their minds, limited the possibilities available to them. A New Guinean named Yali once asked me, "Why do white people have so much cargo while we have so little?" That question lies at the heart of this book. Over thousands of years, Eurasian societies benefited from fertile land, domesticable plants and animals, and an east-west continental axis that allowed agriculture, technology, and ideas to spread easily. These conditions produced dense populations, organized states, and eventually steel, guns, and writing. Elsewhere, in isolated continents like Australia or the Americas, harsh climates and limited species made such progress nearly impossible. I write not to glorify any civilization, but to show that all societies are products of their environments. Had New Guineans lived in the Fertile Crescent, they might have been the conquerors. Had Europeans grown up in isolation, they might have remained tribal farmers. The modern world's inequalities cannot be understood by looking only at the last few thousand years. We must go back 13,000 years to when the first people left Africa, planted the first seeds, tamed the first animals, and began to build the first states. Guns, Germs, and Steel was written to answer Yali's question and to help us see why history took the path it did and not another. In the end, every civilization, large or small, offers a reflection of human adaptation. History is not destiny. It is the result of geography, opportunity, and choice. When we understand that, we no longer see domination or conquest as proof of superiority, but as lessons in how deeply the natural world has shaped who we are. From the Garden of Eden to CAJAMARCA. This first part takes us back to humanity's beginnings, a time when all peoples were equal. No one had steel, guns, or writing. Everyone survived by hunting and gathering, moving with the seasons, living entirely at nature's mercy. Yet within that apparent equality lay the first seeds of difference, differences born not from intelligence, but from environmental fortune. Where the land was fertile, the climate mild, and plants and animals easy to domesticate, people could settle, farm, and grow in number. In harsher, isolated regions, others remained hunters and gatherers, trapped in a perpetual struggle for survival. When the Ice Age ended around 13,000 years ago, a few lucky regions were blessed with conditions that allowed agriculture to emerge. The Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in China, Mesoamerica in the Americas. These people could cultivate crops and raise animals, creating food surpluses, larger populations, and organized societies. Elsewhere, people lacked domesticable species and fertile soil. Their societies stayed small and mobile. Geography had begun to shape destiny. The Polynesians offer a vivid example of how the environment molds human history. Descended from a single ancestral culture, they spread across the Pacific to hundreds of islands. Yet within a few centuries, they became radically different peoples. On large, fertile islands like Tonga and Hawaii, they built kingdoms with chiefs, armies, and monuments. On small, barren islands like Pitcairn or Easter, they struggled to survive. The same people, the same intelligence, but vastly different environments and thus vastly different outcomes. This pattern repeated across the world. The Maori of New Zealand, descended from Polynesian seafarers, conquered the Moriori of the Chatham Islands, who had reverted to a peaceful hunter-gatherer life because of isolation and scarcity. When they met again centuries later, the Maori, with weapons and soldiers, enslaved the Moriori. Geography had created conquerors and victims long before Europeans crossed the oceans. And then came CAJAMARCA, 1532, the turning point of global history. There, 168 Spaniards under Francisco Pizarro captured Emperor Atahualpa and destroyed the mighty Inca Empire in a single day. The Spaniards triumphed not because they were smarter or braver, but because they possessed steel, horses, writing, and invisible allies, germs. Diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles, born from centuries of living with livestock, had already devastated the Inca before the first gun was fired. Cajamarca was not a miracle of conquest. It was the inevitable meeting of two worlds shaped by geography. Eurasia's east-west axis allowed crops, animals, and ideas to spread easily across similar climates. The Americas, stretching north to south, had steep climatic barriers that slowed the spread of agriculture and technology. The Incas could build vast roads and cities, but never invented wheels or iron, not because they lacked genius, but because their world lacked the resources and conditions to make such inventions possible. Thus, history's great imbalance emerged, not from intellect or willpower, but from the uneven distribution of nature's gifts. Those who could farm early built armies, states, and technologies. Those isolated by geography fell behind, not through fault, but through fate. From the Garden of Eden of humanity's hunter-gatherer origins to the bloody meeting at Cajamarca, Part 1 reveals a simple truth. Geography, not biology, determined the course of human history. If Europeans had grown up in New Guinea's mountains, they too might have remained subsistence farmers. If the Incas had lived in Eurasia's vast plains, they might have conquered Spain instead. History, as seen through this lens, is not the story of superior peoples, but of unequal environments. And from those environments arose the guns, germs, and steel that would one day divide the world. Part 2: The Rise of Agriculture. Part 2 tells the story of humanity's greatest turning point, when we shifted from hunting and gathering to farming and herding. This transformation changed not only how we ate, but how we lived, thought, and ruled. It marks the true beginning of inequality and civilization, the moment humans began to control nature instead of obeying it. For most of prehistory, humans lived as nomads, following the rhythm of seasons. Then, around 10,000 years ago, in a few fortunate regions like the Fertile Crescent, China, and Mesoamerica, people discovered that seeds dropped into soil would grow into next year's food. From that simple act came the power to store, to settle, and to plan, a revolution that shaped the modern world. But this leap didn't happen everywhere. Geography chose the winners. Only a handful of plants and animals in the world were suitable for domestication, and most of them lived in Eurasia. Wheat, barley, lentils, goats, sheep, and cattle offered reliable food, while other continents lacked species that could be easily tamed. Australia had no domesticable mammals. The Americas had only the llama. This uneven biological lottery determined where farming, and thus civilization, could begin. With crops and livestock, humans could produce surpluses. Surplus meant that not everyone had to farm. Some could govern, fight, or invent. Villages grew into towns, towns into cities, and cities into states. Food production created power, but it also created hierarchy: kings, priests, soldiers, and slaves. Inequality began not with greed, but with abundance. Agriculture also had its dark side. Permanent settlements bred disease. Living close to animals brought new infections: smallpox, influenza, measles, tuberculosis. At first, these epidemics wiped out millions. Over time, survivors passed on immunity to their descendants. When Eurasians later encountered peoples from the Americas or the Pacific, these invisible weapons, germs, would kill far more effectively than swords or guns. Another key advantage lay in Eurasia's east-west orientation. Because climate and daylight remained similar along its vast width, crops and animals could spread easily from one end to the other. Wheat and sheep could move from Mesopotamia to Spain and India with little change. In contrast, the Americas and Africa stretched north-south. Every few hundred miles, climate shifted drastically, blocking the flow of agriculture and technology. This simple difference in geography would decide the pace of human progress for millennia. As food surpluses expanded, populations exploded. Dense societies needed organization, leading to laws, armies, and bureaucracies. They also needed weapons to defend or conquer farmland. Farming thus became the root of both civilization and warfare. People now fought not for survival alone, but for territory, water, and power. Yet agriculture was not purely a triumph, it was also a trap. Farmers worked longer hours than hunters, ate less diverse diets, and depended on fragile crops. They built walls for protection and temples for order, but also created inequality and suffering. The same seeds that fed humanity also sprouted greed, disease, and conquest. By the end of this transformation, the world was divided between the haves and the have-nots. Some lived amid fertile valleys with oxen, wheat, and bronze. Others wandered dry plains or jungles without beasts of burden or reliable crops. But the gap was not of intellect, it was of ecology. Those who lived in the right place at the right time gained a head start that history would magnify 1,000-fold. Part 2, then, is not just about food, it is about fate. It explains how a simple change in how humans obtained their meals reshaped the planet. From that first planted seed grew everything we now call civilization, and also everything we still struggle with: inequality, disease, and the hunger for power. In short, agriculture was humanity's greatest invention, and its greatest gamble. It gave us cities and empires, but also war and plague. It made us masters of the earth, even as it bound us to the soil forever. Part 3. From Food to Civilization. If Part 2 explained how humans learned to grow food, Part 3 reveals how those harvests gave birth to civilization itself. From food came surplus, from surplus came power, and from power came writing, government, and warfare. Yet every step forward carried a hidden cost. The same forces that built great empires also unleashed disease, inequality, and domination. History, I realized, is never a story of pure progress. It is the story of what humanity sacrifices in the name of advancement. When humans began living close to domesticated animals, they unknowingly invited a host of invisible enemies into their lives. Livestock became the birthplace of deadly germs. Viruses that once infected pigs, cows, and chickens evolved into smallpox, influenza, measles, and plague. In crowded villages and towns, these new diseases spread like wildfire. Millions perished. Yet those who survived passed on immunity to their descendants. Over millennia, Eurasian societies turned this suffering into an unintended advantage: a hardened immune system. Later, when Eurasians sailed to the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific, those same germs became their deadliest allies. The indigenous peoples who had never lived with domesticated animals had no defenses. Epidemics of smallpox and measles wiped out up to 90% of native populations before the conquerors even arrived. Germs, the deadly gifts of livestock, conquered more lands than guns or steel ever could. Meanwhile, as food surpluses grew, societies became more complex. Surplus meant that not everyone needed to farm. Some could rule, build, or fight. Leaders emerged to organize irrigation, defend harvests, and store grain. From these practical needs arose the first governments, systems of control that managed resources but also established inequality. Those who controlled food controlled people. Wealth and power began to concentrate in the hands of the few. With power came the need for record-keeping. Thus, writing was born, not as art, but as administration. The earliest written symbols in Mesopotamia were not poetry or myth, but accounting, tallies of sheep, jars of oil, and sacks of grain. Over time, writing evolved into language, literature, and law. It allowed humans to accumulate knowledge across generations, to build on the discoveries of others. Yet it also created a divide between the literate and the illiterate, between rulers and the ruled. The growth of large populations and centralized control also spurred innovation and technology. Where people clustered in great numbers, competition and communication fostered invention. Ideas could travel from city to city, evolve, and multiply. In contrast, small or isolated communities might invent something brilliant, a new tool, a new craft, but without neighbors to adopt and refine it, the idea often died where it was born. Progress, then, depended as much on connection as on creativity. But civilization brought not only creativity, it brought conflict. Once people had something to lose, land, crops, livestock, they learned to fight for it. Organized warfare emerged alongside organized government. Agricultural societies, with their large populations and soldiers, easily conquered the smaller hunter-gatherer tribes. Yet sometimes, history flipped the script. Nomadic peoples like the Mongols, hardened by harsh environments, swept down to conquer wealthy, complacent empires. Power, I realized, is always shifting, a product of circumstance more than destiny. To justify authority, humans turned to belief. Religion and myth became tools to explain why some ruled and others obeyed. Kings were said to descend from gods. Emperors were chosen by heaven. These beliefs unified people, maintained order, and gave meaning to suffering. But they also cemented hierarchy and obedience, turning social systems into sacred truths. Another major factor in uneven development was the spread of knowledge. Eurasia's interconnected geography allowed ideas, tools, and crops to travel vast distances. The wheel, metalworking, and writing spread across continents, building a shared foundation for innovation. In contrast, isolated regions like the Americas or sub-Saharan Africa had to reinvent everything from scratch. Without horses or oxen to pull them, even simple technologies like the wheel were of little use. The result was not a lack of intelligence, but a lack of access. Geography once again deciding who advanced and who fell behind. Looking back, it becomes clear that civilization was born from a chain of cause and effect that began with food. Surplus led to cities, cities led to kings, kings led to wars, and wars led to empires. Yet each step also brought disease, inequality, and loss of freedom. Civilization is a double-edged sword. It enables art, science, and progress, but also breeds suffering and domination. I do not tell this story to condemn civilization, but to understand it. Every triumph, every temple, every empire, every discovery carries the shadow of its price. The same processes that gave us writing and science also gave us slavery and conquest. Humanity's greatness has always been entwined with its flaws. From food to civilization, this part reveals the deepest paradox of our species. We became powerful not because we conquered nature, but because we depended on it. Our ability to create order also created chaos. Our pursuit of progress came with suffering. And yet, through it all, humans never stopped learning, adapting, and reaching further. Civilization, then, is not a victory march, but an ongoing negotiation between abundance and fairness, knowledge and humility, creation and destruction. It began with a seed, a harvest, and a dream to survive, and it grew into the complex, conflicted world we now call our own. Part 4. The Different Fates of Human Societies. In the final part of Guns, Germs, and Steel, I look back over humanity's long, uneven journey, from a common origin to the striking inequalities that define our world today. We began the same, yet some peoples built empires and technology, while others remained small-scale societies. The question that inspired this entire book, why do white people have so much cargo while we have so little, now returns on a global scale. Why did human societies develop so differently? The answer lies not in race or intellect, but in geography, biology, and the way humans adapted to their surroundings. Nature gave each society a different starting point, and those differences multiplied over millennia. Take New Guinea, where Yali, the man who asked me that haunting question, lived. The New Guineans are among the most resourceful and intelligent people I've ever met. Yet their mountainous homeland has poor soil, few domesticable plants or animals, and is isolated by ocean barriers. Without large populations or trade networks, they could not accumulate surplus or build states. Meanwhile, Eurasia, with its rich variety of crops, animals, and an east-west axis, allowed agriculture, technology, and ideas to spread widely. Over thousands of years, that environmental head start became cultural and political dominance. Consider China, which unified early because its geography, vast plains and connected river valleys favored central control. Europe, by contrast, was fragmented by mountains, peninsulas, and seas. This fragmentation produced competition and diversity. When one kingdom suppressed innovation, another encouraged it. Thus, while China pioneered many inventions first, Europe's divided geography fostered the rivalries that fueled the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, and the industrial age. Stability made China great, competition made Europe powerful. Across the Pacific, Polynesia offered another natural experiment. The same ancestral people spread to hundreds of islands, all starting with the same tools and culture. Yet environmental differences created wildly distinct outcomes. On fertile, resource-rich islands like Tonga or Hawaii, powerful chiefdoms arose. On small, barren islands like Pitcairn or Easter, society stayed small and cooperative. The lesson is clear. Environment shapes opportunity, even among people of the same origin. When Europeans reached the Americas, the meeting of the Old and New Worlds revealed the full weight of geographic history. Eurasia's long exposure to germs, animals, and metal gave Europeans weapons the native peoples had never seen. Smallpox and other diseases killed millions before a single battle was fought. The Incas and Aztecs, advanced as they were, lacked horses, steel, and immunity, not because they were less capable, but because their continent's geography offered fewer resources and greater isolation. The Columbian exchange that followed changed history. Crops like corn, potatoes, and tomatoes spread east, feeding Eurasia's growing populations, while disease, guns, and colonialism spread west, erasing entire civilizations. Turning to Africa, the cradle of humankind, we find not backwardness, but adversity. Its geography, deserts, jungles, and disease zones divided the continent and slowed communication. The north connected with Eurasia, but sub-Saharan Africa was separated by the Sahara and deadly tropical diseases like malaria. Crops and livestock from the north couldn't easily cross into the south, and vice versa. Over time, these barriers limited trade and technological diffusion. When Europeans arrived with guns and ships, they exploited Africa's divisions, enslaving millions and colonizing its lands. Geography, not race, explains Africa's tragedy. Even Japan illustrates the delicate balance between isolation and exchange. Separated from the mainland by narrow seas, Japan could learn from China and Korea, yet remain independent. It borrowed writing, religion, and technology, but adapted them into something uniquely Japanese. When the modern world arrived, Japan's geography helped it transform rapidly, absorbing Western science while preserving its culture. Isolation protected it, connection empowered it. Looking across these examples, the pattern is unmistakable. Geography determines which plants and animals can be domesticated, how populations grow, and how ideas and technology spread. These, in turn, shape economies, governments, and military power. When a society gains advantages in food, metal, or immunity, it expands and influences others. Over centuries, such compounding differences produced the vast global inequalities we see today. But these differences were never inevitable. If New Guineans had lived in Mesopotamia, or if Europeans had been confined to Australia, history might have unfolded the other way around. Human beings everywhere share the same intelligence and potential, only their environments differ. I wrote Guns, Germs, and Steel not to celebrate conquerors, but to explain why some became conquerors at all. When we see that geography, not genes, shaped civilization, we can finally abandon the myths of racial superiority. The story of human history is not a competition between peoples, but an intricate dance between humans and the world that raised them. Part 4 is thus the culmination of the book's journey, a reminder that every empire, every culture, every triumph and tragedy began with the land beneath our feet. Geography granted some societies early advantages, but it did not grant them greater worth. In understanding that, we rediscover a deeper truth, that the fate of nations was never written in blood or brilliance, but in soil, climate, and the accidents of the earth itself.